I'm building a 2-trailer tiny house. It's time for a build update. And today, Mum's gonna be proud because I'm announcing my career as a rapper. Come for the tiny house and stay for the jokes. They're not gonna get better. I'm like one kid away from being a dad. In case you hadn't guessed, I'm gonna talk about wrapping the house. But what some people have said is they find it useful when I talk about the products I'm using. So before I go and show you what I've done, I'm gonna show you what I used. What's really cool about how I wrap the house is the product I've gone with. I've gone with this product called Foam Cell by Fletcher Insulation, and it's different to normal building wrap. It has a layer of foil on each face and is separated by a layer of insulating foam. And what that does is we've got our layer of foil here that reflects radiant heat, and we've spoken about that before, reflects the radiant heat away in summer and the heat back in winter. But this layer of foam insulates these two layers of foil, which stops that radiant heat from radiating back through the foil. So when we've got our radiant heat hitting the foil here, instead of transferring that through into the inside and then radiating out, this insulating foil insulates the top layer of foil from the second layer of foil. Also, from what I can read, this stuff is a compliant thermal break. So for you guys using steel frames, you absolutely want to be looking at this stuff. What it does is all of the heat that's being generated by your cladding, it thermally breaks the cladding from your steel frame. So it stops that steel frame, well, reduces that steel frame from radiating heat through your house. So you want to be looking at this. It's pretty cool stuff to work with. It's quite rigid, which created some challenges in putting it up, but also made it a bit easier to hold it up as I was fixing it. And it has this flap at the bottom, which is really cool because you can overlap the layers of foam cell and you don't actually have to tape it. It creates your moisture barrier. But if you want a vapor barrier, you can tape that down and you get a vapor barrier as well. But the key to making this stuff work properly is an air cavity. So as we've talked about before with reflective insulation, we have to have an air cavity away from our cladding so that it has space to be able to reflect that radiant heat. So I'm going to be using a steel batten. I have a steel batten here, and my cladding is going to be on the outside, so I get this air cavity where the heat that's generated by this cladding can be reflected back out. Now, I am using a steel batten, so I'm going to get thermal transfer through from my cladding into the steel batten, but this, because the foam cell is a thermal break, that'll break it from the substrate of my house. So steel batten I've gone with is just a lightweight rolled batten. If you go to the hardware store, this stuff is called furring channel, sealing batten, goes by a couple names. To fix it on, all you have to do is to screw through the fins into the studs. Make sure you're using sufficient screws. I've gone with a 40mm batten screw. It's basically a tech screw with a tip that will go through steel and timber. If you go with screws that aren't heavy enough or aren't deep enough into the timber, your battens can pull off if you get enough pressure inside. So make sure you're using a substantial screw. The one thing you need to be careful of when you're fixing to this stuff is it's a really light gauge. So when you're putting screws into it, don't over tighten them. You very quickly go from righty-tighty to loosey-goosey and your screw's gonna pull out. Lastly, the thing to get right is make sure you get the right tape. I'm sealing this stuff up with a reinforced foil tape that's designed for building wraps. It's reinforced so it doesn't tear very easy. This stuff sticks really well and it's gonna handle moisture that's on this thing. It'll start pulling the foam cell apart before it actually pulls off. And don't confuse it with aluminium flashing tape that we've used this before on our foil board. This stuff doesn't stick as well, won't handle the moisture, and it tears pretty easy. So make sure you're getting the reinforced stuff. You can see the webbing in it. I wrapped the house by doing the bottom row first. I started in a corner and then worked my way around the house with a roll of foam cell, stapling into the studs as I went. This stuff is a 2-person or a 1-person and a crane job. Because it's so stiff, it's really hard to line up. You have to lift up the whole side of the wall to line it up before you staple it in. Also, because it's so stiff, it kites really well. When the wind gets behind this stuff, it doesn't collapse, and it'll unroll a roll of foam cell faster than a Labrador with a roll of toilet paper. When I first started putting it on, it was a breezy day and I was like a 3-year-old with a staple gun, chucking in staples everywhere. However, I found this wasn't the best idea. At the end of the day, this is a moisture membrane. If you're putting staple holes in everywhere, you are compromising the membrane. Around the walls, this is not a big deal, other than you're gonna have staples that rust, which is not ideal. But on the roof, it was a problem. Because I have such a low gradient roof, I found that moisture was coming in through those staple holes quite easily, so I had to tape it up. So as I went along, I started using much less staples, only in places that I needed, so that I had less holes through the membrane. I've had it suggested that the other way to apply this stuff is to cut it up into panels and then put it onto the house, which makes it heaps easier. Great idea, but it means putting a lot more joints into the foam cell. Does it matter at the end of the day? Probably not, because foil tape is pretty good and it would seal it up, but it would mean that every corner had a joint in it. And look, to be honest, with the crane, it wasn't that hard to run around with an entire roll. Once I had the bottom and the top layer of foam cell on, I went around and battened it off. Again, this is a two-person job. It was a nightmare to try and hold up both ends of the time and screw it into place. But crane came in handy with a pair of vice grips on the hook, managed to hold the other end for me. The other thing I did was to create some timber spacing battens with aluminium tags on the back that allowed me to slot them between the battens and screw them in at a consistent height. This made it heaps easier, and even if you're doing it with two people, it's much easier than trying to measure it each time. With the walls done, I moved on to the roof. I laid the foam cell down over the top, stapled it in, folding it down over the edges of the trailer. So here's the house all wrapped up and battened off. With the exception of the main window here and the door that I tarp up at night, I didn't cut out all of my windows. And the reason for that is I'm using them to keep the house weatherproof while I work on it. You'll notice though, I haven't sealed up the windows, and that allows wind to still push through so that it doesn't pressurize inside and actually rip this stuff off. I found once I had this foam cell on and the battens on, this stuff is super strong. Like, I am crazy impressed. We had 3 days of 40-kilometre-hour winds plus gusts, and this stuff took a beating, and like, you can actually see where it stretched some of the windows a little bit, but it stood up. House wrap probably wouldn't have taken the same beating this stuff got one weekend. So I'm really happy with that, and it's kept it pretty dry inside. I found with the roof where I had penetrations, I did have some problem with leaking, which is to be expected with the amount of rain we got. But once I put some polyurethane sealant on the screw holes, taped up the staples, I only get a couple drips inside now, which is really good. In this internal corner here, where the battens have gone to the corner, it was impossible to stop the edge of the batten from piercing through the membrane. So what I've done is used a piece of foil tape that comes down over the outside of the battens. Now, it's probably been a bit pedantic, but to be honest, if I'm going to have water running down, it's likely to come down through an internal corner here. And if I pierce through the membrane, it makes more chance of moisture getting through to the subframe. So hopefully this will help direct some of the moisture over the outside of my battens and not through into the house. Along the bottom here, you'll notice that I've used the flap of the foam cell to come down over the frame of the trailer. And before I clad, I'm going to run foil tape onto the frame of the trailer. I'm doing that to help combat termites. Researching what to do about termites, I found there's a two-pronged approach. There's physical barriers, stopping them actually entering the house, and chemical ones. Now, I'm going to have to do something if I'm in a termite-prone area, but at the very least, this is helping stop termites physically getting inside my house. Now, because I have a two-trailer tiny house and there's joins here, it's kind of difficult to stop them getting in anywhere, but any small thing that I can help stop termites entering the house are going to help. You'll see in some areas that I haven't finished sealing up the foam cell. The reason for this one is I still have to do the beam that goes over the top of that sliding roof, but I can't put the beam in until I finish taking that roof in and out, because I can't get it out when the trailers are joined. So I'm going to come back and do that later. I just have to cut that up, staple it down, and put the final batten on the top there. On the end here, I haven't finished bringing the foam cell down over the side wall, and that's because I still need to take that foam cell off and get the box cutter out to put my spouts in once I work out where the spouts are going to go in relation to the cladding that goes along this back wall here. And then the foam cell over the top of my shower bump out, I still need to get in there to work on the roof window I'm putting in the shower and a fan, so I've got it just taped down so that it keeps it weatherproof. And once I finish doing that work on the roof, I'll seal that up nice and tight. I've taped up all the joins, which creates my vapor barrier, and I still have a bit more to do to come in and tape them up against all of the other edges once I finish working out how I'm going to make some of these joins work and the flashings work. One of the things with screwing off the battens that I had to be careful with was to resist the urge to screw the batten in and compress the foam up against the stud. Now, on the normal part of the wall where there was just studs, this wasn't a problem because it would just push the foam cell in between the studs and it was compressed over the stud. But in places like the end here where I have brace board, when I screw it in and compress it here, the batten couldn't push the foam cell back into the cavity. It's hard up against that brace board. So I'd get this bow in the batten if I over tighten these screws. So what was really important was to only tighten the screw up to the point where it was just firm against the foam cell and not to create waves in my batten. I then need to make sure I was consistent with that, because on walls where I didn't have brace board in all places, like this one here, there's brace board up there and studs here, that I didn't pull the ones in over the studs because it would put my battens at different heights, particularly at places like here where I have a header over the top of my window. I could end up with a batten at a different height to the other ones. So really important not to over tighten the screws, over compress the foam, to keep all those battens at a consistent height off of the studs. Inside the side trailer here, you'll see I've had to run this aluminium flat bar perpendicular to my top hat. And the reason for that is I don't have any internal structure here. I've used a top hat to span that 2.4 meter length over the top of my sliding roof so that I can get the clearance. but that meant there's nothing supporting this foam cell. Even with the strapping that's there, it wasn't enough, and it could sag at the end there and pour with water. So by running these aluminium flat bar, it holds the foam cell up and stops it from sagging when water's running down over the top of it. Now that I've done that, I haven't had any problem when it rains, but I did have to seal up all the penetrations with polyurethane to stop moisture coming through. Just a quick build update to talk through the wrap on the house. I'm really happy with this stuff. It's a bit more cumbersome than normal wrap to put up, but if you're doing it by yourself, get yourself a crane or call a mate into helping. What I'm really chuffed with though is how well this stuff has stood up to weather. It has taken absolute beating. We get some pretty serious wind through here, and with the battens on the outside, this stuff has been solid, which is great because it's keeping my house weatherproof and it's going to stay exposed like this for a while. So I'm really happy, but it's not the main reason I purchased this stuff. The reason I got this stuff is to combat that dark iron. So I'm really keen to see just how well this stuff's going to perform when I put dark cladding on the outside and how well it stops that radiant heat getting through into the house. Now it's going to be hard because I don't have a control to compare it to, but I am keen to see when we put the foam cell on, insulation on the inside, just how much heat it's going to stop transferring into the house. And we're moving into spring, so it's going to start warming up and be a good time to test it. Next steps is I'm moving on to making my own windows. I've got a heap of Vic Ash in the shed and I've already started working on some designs. Now, I'm pretty excited to show you these because if I can pull them off, they're gonna look $1 million and be pretty unique. So bear with me, I am pretty pumped to show those to you. You guys know the drill. Don't hate, educate, comment down below if something helps inform people, if you see something in this video that can be improved. And if you've had experience with foam cell before, I'd love to hear your experience. Keen to know what the performance is like. In the meantime, go build cool stuff. I still have heaps of work to do, and I'll see you soon.